Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, a brief vibe check on the current state of post-release Skull Merchant and what I would do to get her into the best and healthiest state she can be in. Okay, so I've been playing basically nothing but Skull Merchant for the past month or so since her rework came out, and I have some thoughts. Yeah, we all know I've had my fair share of opinions about the droning killer, especially if you've been keeping up with the absolute saga that was my response chain with Scott Jund. But since the rework, I've been playing her on live, pretty much to the exclusion of everything else. In part because I'm genuinely really enjoying her buffed state, and in part because, I'd rather jump in front of John Kramer in the queue at Lidl than play Twins during the Halloween event. And I'm pleased to say, the buffs that she's received since the PTB have largely treated her very well. Adding the drone rotation mechanic and the 0.3 second arming time have given her way more skill expression by making the power more consistently useful. Now you can see a survivor approaching a drone you set as a trap, and start to rotate it before they get there so that the beam lines up perfectly with them entering the tile. Or you can treat the short arming time like a projectile or a laser, in the vein of Slinger or Xenomorph, and use it to instantly get survivors with a stack, in a process I've called laser tagging. Genuinely, since her PTB, her power has become far more flexible, with a lot more to learn than there used to be, if you really want to learn everything there is to know about this killer, and you might be pleased to know that I'm working on a new comprehensive guide dedicated to her, to answer that exact question. So, watch this space. But it's impossible to ignore just how many people seem to absolutely despise her for a wide variety of reasons. Some folks acknowledge that she's just kind of not their thing, and that's completely fine. We're entitled to our own opinions after all. I know a fair few people who were just traumatised by old Skull Merchant, and yeah, I don't blame you, that shit was foul. But I know quite a lot of people who just seem to have Skull Merchant derangement syndrome, where people are getting mad at shit that just doesn't make sense. At least, not to me. To date, Skull Merchant is the only kill I've ever seen where I can post a clip on Twitter of the survivor I'm going against literally feeding their health state to me like a meat grinder, or I'm not even using my power and two-tapping a survivor as a basic M1, and I still get people moulding about Skull Merchant in my replies as if picking a killer I like has made me ontologically evil. They are Pavlov's dog, seeing the Skull Merchant bell rung and yapping and howling even though there's no food. And I think a lot of it just comes from not knowing anything about the killer post-rework and refusing to learn, because complaining is easier than understanding. Again, my upcoming Skull Merchant guide will be covering misunderstanding that people have about her power and covering her counterplay, so hold out for that one. But despite the incessant screeching of people who claim that Skull Merchant is the worst design killer to ever grace the game, even though they still think that her drones can see you when you're standing still, I do think there is one complaint that definitely warrants addressing, especially after the buffs and mechanical changes to her between PTB and live release, and it comes in the form of a big fat chunky hinder. But before we go any further, I just want to get something off my chest, because I know better than most that trying to have a civilised conversation about Skull Merchant doesn't tend to stay civilised for very long. Today I have a special request. If you feel the urge to hop in the comments, as many do, and complain about how Skull Merchant shot your dog and poisoned your grandma, then please consider, for me, some restraint. Today's my birthday. I'm being dragged to see the FNAF movie today. Something tells me I'm gonna have suffered enough by the time I get home from that cinema tonight. If you've got an insightful opinion or interesting feedback to say whether you agree or disagree with me, then awesome, I'd love to read it. After all, if my dialogue with Scott has proven anything, I hope, it's that I love a good faith dialogue with people who disagree with me. I live on that shit. But if you just clicked on this video to have a bit of a rant, then I have an alternative that we all might enjoy more. In the comments, and this is going to sound really, really nerdy, leave a line from your favourite poem, or a poem that you remember or that you like. And then other people can find your line and find your poem, and then you can find other people's, and it'll all be cosy and pleasant because then everyone's reading everybody else's poetry. Hell, I'll be able to come back from the FNAF movie probably regretting keeping my eyeballs inside my skull, and I'll be able to read some poetry I've never read before, and it'll be a nice surprise for me when I get back. Sorry, a bit of a tangent there. I guess I'll go back to the video. For those who don't know, new Skull Merchant's claw traps attach to you after you take 3 lock-on stacks from drones. But if you cross the scan lines of a drone while a claw trap is attached to you, you get hit with 6 seconds of a 10% hinder, and are revealed on Killer Instinct for half that time. This is meant to be your lethality tool to help you against injured survivors. Since the drones can't down you themselves, it encourages you to commit to chases if survivors letting themselves get easily stacked. Let me be clear, I'm not claiming that current Skull Merchant is too strong right now, she really isn't. I'm not advocating that she get a straight up nerf. But I do not believe this is the best way to give her chase lethality against injured survivors at all. It is by far, I think, the biggest issue with current Skull Merchant, because by all accounts, the rest of her works pretty effectively at what it's trying to do, but the inevitability of getting slapped down with a 10% hinder regardless of what you do makes the end of her chase feel very deterministic. Between the 3% haste she'll get from you being claw trapped and the 10% hinder, you're almost certainly toast at a lot of tiles, and that can feel really bad to be on the receiving end of, and frankly, playing with it feels very cheap sometimes. There's a reason that the most fun way I've found to play Skull Merchant is setting up quick 2-taps, or making stealth plays, or running people into traps and control zones, instead of brute forcing hinder 24/7, because getting a down because a survivor is moving at the speed of a dead snail after they're dead to play a tile with a drone in it can feel quite cheap. It's nowhere near enough to put me off the killer, fat chance of that happening. For me, the journey of setting up a trap play with a drone, or laser tagging and 2-tapping, all that other cool stuff, more than makes up for the destination of a pretty uninteresting 10% debuff. And I take pride in the fact that my good drone spots and usage get them to that destination pretty fucking quickly. But I just wish that her injured survivor chase lethality came in a more interesting and skill expressive form than just breaking the survivor's kneecap with a welding mallet. So if that's a problem with new Skull Merchant, then I very much sympathise. I do not believe the haste is a big issue at all, the numbers are low enough and the durations are short enough that it's pretty inconsequential without the hinder. And since placing a drone or pulling out the radar to rotate or recall a drone halts your bloodlust gain, you'd genuinely be moving faster if you didn't use your power at all and just relied on the haste from bloodlust. On its own, the haste is fine, and if the hinder changes, then there's no reason to touch the haste at all. At the end of the day, it is just worse bloodlust that you get for using your power properly. It's worth noting that I didn't have a problem with the 10% hinder on the PTB version of Skull Merchant, which is why I didn't bring it up before. PTB Skull Merchant had way less control over the drones, since laser tagging and switching the rotation didn't exist yet, so getting claw trapped happened a lot less frequently and could be more easily avoided. Now that she's actually a decent killer and can get a claw trap on you pretty quickly, getting scanned while claw trapped shouldn't be basically the end of the chase. There should be something else that she has to do to confirm that down. I think slapping a 10% hinder on you out of nowhere lets her kind of play with stabilizers on, which is a shame when all the stuff that goes on elsewhere in her kit is so interesting. At least it's interesting to me. So the automatic 10% hinder is a problem. It is the problem. It makes the end of her chases very anticlimactic and flattens her skill floor and seeing together in that section of the chase. So how can we address this without nerfing the killer? Her power level in these situations isn't a problem. It's the ease with which that power converts into a down. Well, I think a good place to start would be looking at other chase tools that we can give her as a bonus for stacking claw trap survivors. Drones downing survivors on their own would be a terrible idea, I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that one, and it would need to be thematic and in keeping with her identity. Giving her a teleport, for example, would be out of place on a non-supernatural killer whose technology is meant to be modern day, or close to it at least. One idea that I found on Twitter and absolutely fell in love with was an idea by someone called Ayuki Airlines, who said that the drone should shock you out of interacting with objects like Doctor's shock therapy attack. This was an idea that I jumped on because Doctor was the first real 115 chase killer in the game's history, so I'm surprised that the idea of directly harassing survivors off of interaction points hasn't been reused. We've had half a dozen dashing killers, 2 stalking stealth killers, and like a million mid-range zoners, but we've never had another interaction like Doctor. And letting claw traps shock survivors out of being able to interact with pallets and windows would be a great alternative to just breaking the survivor's ankles with a chunky hinder. And it would be thematic too. Adriana is a sadist who loves to play with her food, and shocking her helpless victims with a device she attached to them would be something that she'd enjoy doing just for fun. So I iterated on the idea a little bit further. Obviously, claw trap disabling interactions passively would be a nightmare, so maybe make it something that you can activate attached to the radar system. Someone runs into a drone when they're claw trapped, you press a button, and then they and everybody else who's got a claw trap on them gets shocked, so you can catch up to them and down them before they can draw a pallet or vault a window. It would be functionally similar to the 10% hinder. Some punishment for running into a drone while already claw trapped to let Skull Merchant commit to chases without raw dogging them as an M1 with 2% haste. But it would be a power reliant on good timing and tracking survivor actions to pull it off, meaning that a bad Skull Merchant who can't time her shocks properly, or keep marking you with beams, would be kept at a tile for a while by a survivor who calls her on it and keeps running the loop. The shock, I think, would make her more skill expressive and interesting to use and to go against, raising her skill floor substantially. But remember, the goal isn't to nerf her, and we can't forget, Doctor's not exactly a great killer himself. The big problem with Doctor is that he doesn't really have a power against survivors who are holding Shift W, or, more egregiously, survivors with bad ping, since by the time the terrible connection registers that they've been shocked, they'll have already vaulted the pallet, meaning they'll get out scot-free even if the Doctor timed his shock perfectly. With that in mind, I think attaching a small hindered effect to the shock would help it be a little bit more consistent, especially since you'll be losing bloodlust to pull the radar out in the first place and go for a shock. Again, I want to give the killer a good reason to use the power instead of just bloodlusting, and attaching a small hinder to the shock would be a perfectly fine incentive, as long as it isn't the ankle breaker that she has currently. So my recommended change list, the final version, is as follows. Claw-trapped survivors are no longer automatically hindered when scanned by a drone. Killer Instinct duration increases from 3 seconds to 6 seconds. When a survivor is spotted on Killer Instinct, the radar gains a new function, Neuroshock. When Neuroshock is used, every survivor currently holding a claw trap on the map is instantly shocked for 2.5 seconds and receives a 5% hindered debuff for the same duration. Shocked survivors cannot interact with objects for the duration of the shock and scream, interrupting any actions they were doing. For what it's worth, by the way, that's half the hindered effect that she currently has, with less than half the duration. And this comes with a few recommended changes that I have for her add-ons as well. Of course, the add-ons that boost her hindered would need adjusting for Neuroshock instead. In addition, Skull Merchant has a small selection of add-ons that are boring, don't do enough for their rarity, or are just plain dog shit. So here's what I do to these add-ons as well. Adiviente Issue 1 is a skill check add-on that really belonged more on old Skull Merchant than new Skull Merchant, so I'd love to see that changed. New low power mode is completely brain dead. It makes Skull Merchant play more like Artist than Skull Merchant, and all we need to do is have an undetectable nerf attached to low power mode, and the original reason the add-on got changed would be totally invalid. Dance movement prediction isn't that bad, but the information that you get from it is the same as the information you get from the radar, so adding a second effect to it by revealing auras of survivors who ditch their claw traps would give it some added utility to justify its high rarity, and expired batteries is just shit and boring for an ultra rare add-on, so I've given it a whole new effect. Other than the 10% hinder and a few add-on changes, the only complaint that I have about current Skull Merchant is the bugs, because yeah, she's quite buggy and no one's talking about it. Sometimes a drone that she deploys will appear in the wrong place. Other times it won't deploy at all. Other times again it'll deploy but it won't rotate. And other times again, it deploys but the model doesn't rotate even though its detection box does. Meaning the survivor can get tagged by a drone that really doesn't look like it should be tagging them. Beyond that, I think Skull Merchant is pretty much fine as she is. And while this isn't unpopular opinion for sure, I know I'm not the only one. I pretty regularly play Survivor with a friend or two, although I don't play solo queue for the life of me. And every Survivor player I play with on a regular basis at worst tolerates Skull Merchant, at least more than a lot of the actually insufferable killers, and at best actively enjoys Skull Merchant matches that we play. Most of these people don't even play her either, they just know how she works to understand her counterplay enough to be able to enjoy their matches. This killer is not impossible to enjoy playing or playing against, and I really resent the narrative that there's nothing fun about her, because for the right people there obviously demonstrably is. I hope as player understanding gets better, and hopefully the devs continue to iterate on the character's balance and gameplay loop, Skull Merchant becomes a more accepted killer as time goes on. Even though the well is probably poisoned so badly by now that I doubt her reputation can be salvaged at this point. Well, on the bright side, I doubt she's going to be staying as the community scapegoat for very long, because those trick stuff landed on the PTB, and oh boy, that's going to be an experience if those make it to live. Just another day in the fog, eh?